On behalf of the Center for Theories and Historical Research, I would like to welcome the faculty members, students, and external audience who have all joined us tonight. I am particularly happy to welcome our Reinhard Koselleck guest professor, Ethan Kleinberg. We are delighted that you, Ethan, are here tonight to give the third Koselleck lecture within the context of a faculty colloquium that rings in the new semester. The Reinhard Koselleck Visiting Professorship was established by the Faculty of History, Philosophy, and Theology and the Rectorate to honor Reinhard Koselleck's long-standing activity at Bielefeld University. Koselleck's work had a tremendous influence on historical studies in particular and the humanities in general. His intertwining of historical phenomena and the reflection on historical concepts and temporal structures was unparalleled. To honor his memory, every 2 years, the faculty invites outstanding scholars whose work has made a significant contribution to theoretical reflection on historical research. We are very happy that Ethan Kleinberg has accepted the invitation to be our guest professor this year. With Professor Kleinberg, we have gained not only an excellent theorist of history, but a scholar who constantly thinks about how theories can and should modify forms of historical practice and writing. But the thing is, introducing Ethan Kleinberg is not an easy task. Presenting a scholar in an academic context usually means telling the story of their biographical academic past. It tends to be structured chronologically, either in ascending order from the formative years to the pinnacle of their current position, or descending from the triumph back to its origins. But how do I present a scholar like Ethan Kleinberg, whose theoretical effort involves reversing how we think about the past? On the one hand, he sees the past as non-existent and therefore impossible to reconstruct or find. At the same time, he considers the past to be latent in the present, albeit in altered forms. This paradox is visible in a chapter called The Past That Is, in his book, Haunting History. The word is crossed out. If I want to take his theoretical effort seriously, and I do, I cannot use classic academic parlance and a typical narrative introduction structure. That would mean telling you a coherent story in the purest Rankian sense of history, wie es wirklich gewesen ist. And how student Ethan Kleinberg became distinguished professor Ethan Kleinberg. It would be a litany of sentences in the simple past tense, like this. Following his PhD in history at USLA in 1998, Ethan Kleinberg became assistant professor of history at Iowa State University and subsequently at Wesleyan University. His first book, Generation Existential, Heidegger's Philosophy in France, was published 2005. And so on in a triumphalist narration up to his current position, with his activities expressed, of course, in the present perfect tense. Since 2012, he has been editor-in-chief of the journal Theory in History, and since 2018, he has been class of 1958 Distinguished Professor of History and Letters at Wesleyan University. I would then conclude with the future progressive. His new book, Emmanuel Levinas' Talmudic Turn, is coming out in 6 days. Such an introduction could never do justice to Ethan Kleinberg's deep reflection on history and the past. But what is history for Ethan Kleinberg? In his words, it's the presence of absence. He expands on this idea in Haunting History for the Constructive Approach to the Past, which was published in 2017. The book challenges both ontological realism, that is, the belief in facts, and its methodological pendant, the tendency to ontologize the remains. Ontologizing remains of the past means, and I quote, to make them present by assigning them to a specific location in space and time that is, in principle, observable and as such fixed and immutable, end of quote. A position that might seem close to that of thinkers of a presence, like Gumbrecht, Ankersmit, Domanska, Runia. Using the presence paradigm, these thinkers are attempting to move away from the culture of interpretation and its consequence and intellectual relativism towards the real that actually exists. In their view, the unmediated experience of a present and the contact with material things would protect us from the ambivalence and multiplicity of interpretation. And now back to the dilemma of showcasing Ethan Kleinberg's academic history. What narrative or non-narrative structure would the presence paradigm imply? To begin with, it would probably mean the printed CV, which I can touch. The presence paradigm would simply invite me to read a long sequence of very real printed signs, Arabic numbers, letters in the English alphabet, and punctuation marks, all combined in a tabular order. For instance, fellowship and awards. 2021, Reinhard Koselleck, guest professor, Center for Theories of History, Bielefeld University, full stop, October-December 2021. 2018, Professeur Invité, Université Bordeaux-Montaigne, full stop. And so on for another 18 entries. That is the real presence I'm dealing with, the metonymical fragments for events that are temporally absent. Maybe this method of scrutinizing Ethan Kleinberg's CV is just a hyperbolic reductio ad absurdum of the presence paradigm. But that doesn't solve the question of how to write about the past from a presence perspective. Ethan Kleinberg himself was critical of the thinkers of a presence in the book Presence, Philosophy, History, and Cultural Theory of the 21st Century, which he edited with Ranjan Ghosh in 2013. Here he suggests a decisive inversion of the way we think about the past. He imagines the past as the forces that press upon us but are not accessible, as having nothing comforting but instead troubling us, like Jacob Marley's warning ghost in Dickens' A Christmas Carol, or the avenging ghost of Hamlet's father in Shakespeare's eponymous tragedy. According to Ethan Kleinberg, there is no origin to hunt for, only the disturbing remains of a past that haunts us. The metaphor of a troubling ghost or specter which Ethan borrows from Derrida allows us to think of a history capable of embracing the difference of interpretations and of continuing to listen to, I quote, possible histories of groups and events that had previously resided as ghosts haunting the dominant historical narrative. End of quote. It's a history that, as he puts it, can never rest in peace. But this perspective turnabout from hunting the past to being haunted by the past impacts on his idea about the theory of history. In his Geschichtstheorie an der blog post, Ethan Kleinberg imagines the theory of history as a mode of listening not only to the past, but also listening for the myriad ways that the past comes into our present. And now a final return to the opening question of how to present Ethan Kleinberg's academic journey in terms of his reflection on the spectral nature of the past. The classic hypotactic career path narrative and the paratactic list in a printed CV are ways of telling the story. But these narratives are neither exclusive nor definitive, nor indeed the best. In fact, his CV and the histories it allows to be told are silent when it comes to the academic ghosts that haunt Ethan Kleinberg. The specter of Heidegger's existentialism on the rive gauche, the specter of Derrida's différance, and the specters of Cladenius, Droysen, and Dilthey, whose concepts warn us against a possible relapse into historiographic positivism. But perhaps the most disturbing specter, silent in Ethan Kleinberg's CV, but latent throughout his work, is the recurring question: how to write history without falling back into ontological realism? What narrative form can account for the co-presence of mutually incompatible histories or the latency of possible histories? This question is already present in Ethan Kleinberg's Generation Existential, in which he observes that the intellectual history of Heidegger's reception in France is a paradoxical enterprise. Writing a history of this kind requires the very strategies of narration and representation that Heidegger's philosophy calls into question. Further reflection on these issues remain a desideratum in the book. The question continues to hover in Ethan Kleinberg's writing and finds maybe a moment of rest in his Emmanuel Levinas' Talmudic turn. Here, the conflicting historical registers, rational, scientific, and believing religious, and the different ways of telling Levinas' relationship to the Talmudic tradition are co-present on the page, written in two columns. This layout counteracts the authority of a unique interpretation of the past. The competing text columns, and I quote from the introduction, are designed to inform, challenge, and drive the reader forward. End of quote. Is this deconstructive approach Ethan Kleinberg's first step towards reconciling with his own ghost? In other words, towards solving the question to how to write history? Ethan, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you, Lisa, for really a wonderful introduction in which the ghost of me is present. I have a chapter in Haunting History, Back to Where We've Never Been, and I sort of feel as though I've now gone back to where I've never been. And I don't know that one will ever rest in wrestling with a ghost, but certainly it was a wonderful way for me to move forward into what I'm going to speak about tonight, and this coming project that actually is moving forward from both Haunting History and Emmanuel Levinas's Talmudic Turn. So I should also say, as suggested in the introduction, it is truly an honor to deliver the Koselleck lecture to all of you. And I'm really grateful to my friends and colleagues at Bielefeld University for the invitation to speak to you tonight, and especially to come spend time with you in November and December. And actually, I'm going to start teaching a master's seminar tomorrow, which Lars and Zoltan and I refer to as the greatest course ever. We'll see if that comes to pass. But I do want to thank you, especially Lisa, Lars, Zoltan, Franz, Angelika, Bettina, Zilka, Britta, Willibald, and everyone else who made this happen. And I should also say, in a more confessional mode, that while it's a huge honor to present the Koselleck lecture, it's also been a source of some anxiety as well because of the scholar for whom the lecture is named. Let's face it, there are few who can measure up to Reinhard Koselleck. And I should add to that while my work is deeply indebted to the scholarship of Koselleck, I'm not what one would call a faithful reader or deployer of his work and methodology. And actually, there are those who claim I can be quite reckless. But fortunately for me, I find this liberating. And so it's in this spirit that I will proceed. There's definitely something of an inverted chiastic effect with me presenting this lecture to open the semester. As the last lecture I presented at Bielefeld was for a closing. That lecture was on something I call temporal anarchy. And what I will present tonight is a further preliminary investigation that is part of the same book project. And as I suggested, I've come to realize that what I'm constructing is in fact a trilogy of sorts, beginning with Haunting History, which is a polemic against recent dominant trends in history that offers my deconstructive approach as an alternative, followed by Emmanuel Levinas's Talmudic Turn, Philosophy and Jewish Thought, in which I deploy my deconstructive approach to history. And that does come out on October 19th, very soon. And now this book that I'm currently writing, tentatively titled The Surge, in which I will attempt to provide a prescriptive theory that's based on, but more general than the deconstructive approach. It is, or will be, I hope, a theory of history for our moment. So what is our moment? I am going to argue that we've reached the end time of truth. We aren't the first to live through such times, and one could imagine parallels with the early modern era at the moment of the Copernican and then the scientific revolutions. That was a moment of radical instability, pushback, and eventually change as to the coordinates of true and false, as well as the basis on which one might make such judgments. Lorenzo Valla's famous Declamatio demonstrating that the donation of Constantine was a forgery comes to mind, as does the work of Galileo, Descartes, Bacon, or Hume, not to mention the innovative Mexican thinker Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who grabbed hold of the new learning to argue against misogyny and for the education of women. The results of this earlier end time are often retrospectively imploded in a narrative of progress, leading necessarily to our current scientific and secular standards of evidence and proof, which both naturalizes our current conception of true-false and blinds us to the frailty of the systems which hold these conceptions. The moment itself was more fraught, as the debates, denials, and excommunications attest. Looking back from the 19th century, Nietzsche decried the, quote, good faith in science, the prejudice which dominates the modern state, end quote, that had been accomplished, and his madmen famously announced the murder of God, demanding to know how we could drink up the sea, who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon. What were we doing when we unchained the earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continuously? As we all know, Nietzsche's madmen came to realize that he had arrived with his warning too soon. Our moment is an interesting and dangerous one because we are plunging continuously. The authority of the expert, the scientist, the historian has waned such that the epistemic fabric, which held our conception of truths and facts firm in relation to the authority of science, has become loose, even undone. One place this has become apparent is the proliferation of conspiracy theories which serve as a canary in the coal mine of weakening epistemic certainty. In an interview with Der Spiegel, Marty Baron, who was the executive editor of the Washington Post, stated that we are confronting a level of conspiracy thinking unlike any we have seen before. In response to a question as to whether there is anything that can be done to reach the conspiracy-minded, Baron confessed he had no answer to the question. Quote, conspiracy thinking is deeply entrenched. Once people start to think that way, it's very hard to persuade them that they are disconnected from reality. They see us in the mainstream media as the ones who are lying. They see themselves as the ones who possess the truth, end quote. Baron's conclusion is that we have entered an era of false belief with little hope that the prior consensus on standards of truth and evidence can be reclaimed. Another contemporary example is the rise of cyber or cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin and Dogecoin, the latter a currency that actually began as a joke. In Goethe's Faust Part 2, it's Mephistopheles himself who introduces the possibility of disconnecting paper money from the gold meant to back it when he answers the emperor's request to procure funding. So please excuse the English translation of the German. But Mephistopheles says, I can perform as much, more than you say. It's easy in a difficult way. The stuff lies there already, yet to reach it. There's a subtle art, and who can teach it? Just think on those calamitous occasions when land and folk were swept by armed invasions, how this or that man, deep in terror's meshes, would rush to hide all that he held most precious. That was in ancient Roman times the way, and ever since, till yesterday, today. These hoards lie buried in the ground, and it, the soil's the emperor's, is the benefit. To be clear, Mephistopheles convinces the emperor to produce paper money to cover the debts of the realm based on treasure ostensibly buried in the ground that is of yet undiscovered. This is an illusion of wealth which holds no value beyond the faith or belief in the emperor, the land the emperor controls, and the ability of the emperor to pay off in the future the debts incurred today. Now, such a belief in the full faith and credit of the modern state has long been the basis for economic policy. But cybercurrency pushes this faith beyond even Mephistopheles' wildest dreams. It's a currency based solely on the faith in what it's worth, uncoupled from anything tangible, be it government, state, or land. It is worth, well, whatever it can be worth. Its value is surely real, but also fragile and tenuous, a currency for the end time of truth. In history, too, the stability of our previous moment has been supplanted and fragmented by a proliferation of histories offered by historians and non-historians alike, each running on the outdated assumption that their account of the past correlates to that past on a one-to-one ratio. To use Nelson Goodman's assessment, and here I quote Goodman, no one of these different descriptions is exclusively true, since the others are also true, end quote. So in Goodman's constructivist analysis, this leads to the conclusion that, quote, None of them tells us the way the world is, but each of them tells us a way the world is, end quote. In our current moment, however, the ontological realist employing a correspondence theory of the past, which I would argue is the prevailing mode, concludes that if all of them can be true, then none of them are actually true. This is the shift from truth to post-truth. Scholars and those who work on the past in particular should realize that the epoch of scientific authority is a historically contingent one. And in this regard, they should be prepared for the possibility that the results of scientific investigation or a preponderance of empirical evidence may no longer be taken as articles of faith. This makes our current epistemological and political moment a perilous and important one. But as Donna Haraway remarked in the New York Times, quote, "It's also an important moment not to go back to very conventional and very bad epistemologies about how scientific knowledge is put together and why and how it holds," end quote. This is to ask, do we really want to return to the era of blind obedience to white men in white lab coats? Have we forgotten that the epistemic regime that rested on such total faith in science also featured appropriately garbed doctors selling cigarettes, advocating better living through chemistry, or proselytizing for eugenics? Modern day pundits and intellectuals do us all a disservice by hearkening to the good old days before science, truth, and enlightenment values were destroyed, all the while pointing at facts and truths and then becoming apoplectic when they aren't believed. Thus, while historians and other scholars who work on the past have long understood the historical contingency of the epoch of scientific authority, because their work engages with the ways that the regimes of knowledge shift and change over time, this very epoch of scientific authority coincided with the formation and rise of disciplinary history. As a result, the historian's tools of analysis and argument have been blunted. In essence, the historian is entangled because their mode of analysis is itself now an object of historical analysis. In 1969, Koselleck emphasized the irony that what he called history pure and simple, Geschichte schlechthin, or history itself, Geschichte selber, did not originally refer to objectivity and the notion of realistic representation, but which underpinned historical methodology, but instead signaled the need for theory in history precisely to address the historicized entanglement of the historian with their object of study. But any theory of history to which we must turn now cannot be one imperiled by the end time of truth. From a constructivist position, however, the end time of truth simply exposes the ways that history is built and deployed in the present. The ways that histories are made and not found. Now, this is not to say that the past never happened or certain events did not exist, but instead to point out that ultimately, it is more important to convince others that such events happened in such a way than to portray them as they really happened, or even that they happened at all. It is in this sense that Koselleck states in regard to issues of memory and experience, quote, "The false testimony of a contemporary will always remain a more immediate source, even if it is later unmasked," end quote. And also that, quote, "It is clear that there can be no pure Zeitgeschichte in the sense of a mere history of the present, and at the very least, it must refer to a past present and its past. First comes the history, then its narration, which does not rule out the existence of histories that consist only of their narration," end quote. The narration here includes histories of events that happened, that did not happen, or for which we only have the narration, but no corroborating evidence. This is the game of history, and if one is successful, then such a past does exist for us. This is the game of history, and if one is successful, then such a past does exist for us and appropriates all the ontological properties we commonly afford to any commensurate happening in the present. Of course, I have to confess that I am a strange constructivist, as Lisa suggested, as I also hold that these constructions are moved by the past, to use Ilko Runia's term, or haunted, to employ my own. It's my conviction that the past is a site of spectrality, of ghosts and hauntings, such that in Haunting History, I argue that the past is both a present and an absence, a specter or ghost that haunts our present. To quote that work, the past is and is not, or better yet, it is, with the is crossed out here. The past comes and goes, and the pieces we do have are shot through with the non-synchronicity of prior historical tellings. This argument about the past doubles as an ontological questioning of the present. If the past is restricted, crossed out, barred, what kind of present can now be reconceived? The present does not exist as a direct extension of the past, just as historical inquiry cannot treat the past as ontologically given. In returning to the present, inquiry must approach the present and the intervention it seeks to make in the present, first of all, as a performative interpretation, and an interpretation that transforms and even hijacks the past for which it provides an account. To follow the analysis of Stefanos Hierolanos, the problem is that the present historians imagine is itself anachronistic. To quote Hierolanos, in the name of a certain subjectivism, problems visible in the present are projected and sources for them derived in the past. For it, the present becomes a simulacrum of the past future, just as this past is essentialized as the past of the historian's present, end quote. The fiction of a stable past is the fiction of a stable present. Seemingly solid rules of evidence and argument simply no longer hold sway. As a result, the coordinates by which we understand politics and ethics have been obscured, especially the historical ones. I want to engage with our current historical moment, both where we are in and how we think about history, by means of two terms loosely borrowed from distributional semantics in the field of artificial intelligence. These are temporal vectors and the compass. Temporal vectors are a means to understand semantic change over time, but they are unstable because while time is moving through them, we are also moving through time. The compass, however, serves as a heuristic device which provides an atemporal vector, outside of time as it were, which provides stable coordinates by which we can orient ourselves. We can think of our relationship to the past as akin to temporal vectors. While the historian produces history, history also produces the historian. Each is moving through the other. Throughout the late 19th and into the 20th, and even into the 21st century, the discipline of history has purported to provide a compass, an atemporal vector outside of time, to navigate our relationship to the past and provide coordinates for political and ethical pronouncements. If we look to Kosellek's brief observation, translated into English as constancy and change of all contemporary histories, conceptual historical notes, we might conclude that this has always been the case. To quote Kosellek, there are diachronic and synchronic dimensions at work at various temporal depths, about which historians from distant epochs can still help us gain insight for today. Because history repeats itself structurally, something that is often forgotten when singularity is stressed, end quote. To be clear, Kosellek is speaking of social psychological processes that he considers to be constants throughout the history of events, whether past or future. This account of history in human nature actually differs little from that of Thucydides in the history of the Peloponnesian War, where he concludes that those readers, quote, who want to look into the truth of what was done in the past, which, given the human condition, will recur in the future, either in the same fashion or nearly so, will find this history valuable enough, as this was composed to be a lasting possession and not to be heard for a prize at the moment of a contest, end quote. Well, it certainly did last. The emphasis on the structural repetition of social psychological processes or a permanent human condition provides a compass, an ahistorical vector outside of time, which allows for all aspects of the past to be explained from the vantage of the present, and even a future present. In Matter and Memory, however, Henri Bergson provides an account of the phenomenon known as déjà vu, or the sense that one has previously experienced what is currently happening as if it had already taken place. On Bergson's account, what one actually experiences is not something that already happened, but the contemporaneous realization that they will remember it. It is a recognition to come, which Bergson sees as the formation of a memory of the present in real time. Historians encounter something similar when they posit a permanent interpretive structure, a compass outside of time, by which to decipher, interpret, and implot the past. The sensation appears to them as a re-encounter with something that already occurred, just like déjà vu. By following this atemporal compass of history, they purport that this is indeed the way it really happened. What they are actually experiencing is not the past as it really happened, however, but the contemporaneous realization that they are making history. Just as the experience of déjà vu reveals the dissonance of a colliding past and present, there is a similar dissonance between the permanent structure proffered and the history presented to justify its stability. This is the place where, as in déjà vu, time is out of joint. But here it is because the historian fails to take into consideration the historical conditions, the temporal vectors of these so-called permanent structures. These are the historically determined conditions of possibility, which restrict what we can imagine as possible pasts. In so doing, the historian transports their sense of what should be back into the past, all the while ascribing a sense of permanence to these normative values. The order we want the past to have is taken to be the order it actually had, at the expense of other possible ways of ordering or accounting for the past. The matter is further complicated by the way these histories profess to guide us into the future. The events of the past here serve as justification for a lesson to be learned in the future that is unwarranted because of its anachronistic relation to the present. In this light, we can rethink Aleida Assmann's statement about how, quote, the future was for the temporal compass what the North Pole is for the spatial compass, a steady and reliable source of orientation in movement. The future was a continuing promise, end quote. To my mind, this was only the case insofar as we believed it to be so, and is akin to the promise of treasure buried in the ground, yet currently undiscovered. As our epistemic fabric has loosened, the general belief in history's ability to provide such a compass has waned, and with it, disciplinary history's role as an arbiter of politics or ethics. The very notion of a compass of history, a mechanism to tell us where we've been and where we want to go, is indicative of the emancipatory desire at work in all of the accounts we have discussed, be it the obligation to a faithful representation of the past, a responsibility to the memory of the dead, the possibility of meaningful intervention in the present, or for the organizing principle, the vector outside of time that will give us meaning now and for the future. This desire, however, remains forestalled as an emancipatory promise, in part because it is locked up by the transhistorical and thus changeless mechanisms intended to serve as history's compass, but also and crucially, because at the end time of truth, our belief in such a compass of history outside of time has lost its hold. What's more, this prior mechanism was always as much a closing off of possible pasts as an opening to their truth. It was always based on what we imagined to be the only paths possible. The compass of history as an ahistorical vector is dominated by the presence of the present, which reaches back to tell the past what to be. What I want to do is reverse this movement and this temporal flow to put emphasis on the absent past that meets us, though I want to do so without reifying this reversal. What I propose is that we rethink the compass of history at the end time of truth as one shorn of its atemporal dimension, embracing instead a logic of anachrony, temporal anarchy rather than atemporality. So what I mean by this is a compass that does not stand outside of time, but one that points to sites where the past surges into the present unexpectedly, touching us and connecting with our concerns not only for the present, but also toward the future. This might be something one sees, or hears, or feels. It is the past lifting us up, or pushing us forward, perhaps even pushing us under. We should not fight it, and we certainly cannot control it, though one can ride it. This movement is what I call the surge. In Haunting History, I describe how at any given moment, a sudden surge can bring evidence of past remains to the surface. In that work, I use the metaphor of the ocean as the site of the surge, but one might also imagine a surge of wind, of power, of sound. Recent films involving the supernatural, ghosts or haunting spirits, it's almost Halloween after all, malevolent, misunderstood, often signal the arrival of this present absence with a surge of electricity overtaxing the lights or by a surge of sound, sometimes even blowing the lights up and leaving us in darkness, or reaching a deafening crescendo, leaving us in silence. We are, by and large, afraid of surges, and I would suggest that we are equally afraid of the past. This is at least part of my argument in Haunting History. The instability of such open possibilities is disturbing, and conventional history often serves as an anesthetic that desensitizes us to its jarring effects. As such, conventional history does not leave the past in its otherness, but always includes it in a whole, calling this a historical perspective. The modes of history we have discussed are about controlling the past and limiting the surge, as is the ahistorical compass limiting the temporal vectors of history and historian, even if the goal of such protections can be laudable when based on an emancipatory desire and promise. But as in Haunting History, where I demonstrate the ways that the noble goal of forging a path to the past, a poros, simultaneously creates an aporia, the purportedly ahistorical compass of history is the arbiter of meaning deployed by conventional history, actually restricts our gaze and our attunement to the possible pasts and past possibles surging forth to meet us. It is to these surges of the past, these ghosts, that we should be attuned. These are the histories that need to be heard, not in the purged, restricted, and methodologically homogeneous version demanded by conventional history, but as histories that open space for multiple and conflicting logics of how we encounter, account for, and recount the past. The surge is the unfettered intermingling of past, present, and future. It is free and generous and dangerous. The compass I propose is a surge detector that seeks the sites of political and ethical intervention, and as such engages in a different logic of history and a different mode of argument. The anachrony of the surge, the unrestrained mingling of past, present, and future, is disorienting compared to the atemporal neutrality of a magnetic compass pointing north. But just as the magnetic poles of our planet have shifted, rendering such a compass misaligned, our old modes of history cannot guide us at the end time of truth. Instead, we need a new compass of history that is not restrained by what has been and is instead attracted to what can be, thus pointing us toward critical, political, and ethical action. A key question, of course, is how one pursues criticism and ethics without a normative definition of the two or having to resort to the concept of regulative ideas. It's a question Lisa posed to me a couple months ago. I would say I'm sufficiently constructivist and Nietzschean to operate with an unbound and historically contingent understanding of ethics and ethical action. Then again, I'm trying to think through the ways that the surge either brings the past to us or helps us rise to meet it in ways that make for these ethical and political commitments. On this understanding, there is no one normative definition or regulative guideline. Thus, there is the very real potential that the ethical or political intervention which prevails may not be the one which you or I would hope for. And this indeed is the danger. But is that not the case now? And would it not be better to confront this instability and this danger on the front end? This new compass of history attuned to the surge enables us to reimagine the emancipatory promise of history. This will be, and here I offer a modification of Derrida from Spectres of Marx, a matter of thinking with a new logic of history, not another history or a new historicism, but another opening of eventness as historicity that permits one not to renounce, but on the contrary, to open up access to an affirmative thinking of the emancipatory promise as promise and not as a definitive cipher or design. It is not a teleology or a regulatory ideal. The key to fulfilling the promise resides in the opening of access to other events in the past as history and other openings of eventness as historicity. The temporal anarchy of this fulfillment is that it must sustain itself as a continuous act, which paradoxically can never be fulfilled. It must be continued. By attuning ourselves to the surge and to these ghosts, to the ways they tear at conventional understandings of time and temporality, historians can take up their cause, which is also our own. I take this to be an attunement to the past that allows such an historian or thinker to hear the call of the absent, missing, or hidden dead. In this way, the dead are not taken as persons or commodities no longer present, whose properties and scope have been previously determined. Instead, the historian listens to the dead that haunt us as the presence of an absence out of time, which is as of yet for us unknown and undetermined. This allows, or perhaps opens space for multiple and conflicting logics of how we encounter, account for, and recount the past. The actors and vocabularies may be unorthodox, or the accounts may be poetic, but these myriad approaches and definitions of history force us to question the dominance, politics, and ideologies behind any one variant. To return to the ocean metaphor, we must learn to surf the surge, to ride with a history of differing logics and approaches to the past, rather than battle against it by imposing methodological uniformity applied to an ever-increasing field of areas and subjects. Our new compass of history is an attunement to the otherwise of the past, which is likewise an attunement to the other in our present. As such, the past provides the call for a moral imperative in the present and a moral imperative for the future. The emancipatory promise of the surge is imbued with the potential to transform our present, but only if the particular event surging from the past, now as history, is not left in the past as though the danger is over and done with, or entirely appropriated by the present telling, the telling that we want it to be. Vladimir Yankelevich warned of the ever-persistent march of time that inevitably leads to forgetting, and with that forgetfulness, a washing away of past wrongs. The historian's calling has long been to battle against this river of Lethe. But perhaps more pernicious is the way that the historical focus on evils and wrongs of the past can allow us to ignore or demote the evils and wrongs of our present. This is what Bevernage has called temporal Manichaeism. Our new compass of history is attracted to the surge via an attunement to the past in the present that allows each to travel through the other, our temporal vectors. The evils of the past cannot be left in the past, but neither can they be co-opted by my present in the form of a select group or individual. The compass of history instead must be a tool that actually punctures time. The work of history here should not be the work of listening to ourselves and our own laments, but listening to the ghost, hearing the past, attunement to the other coming from a different temporal direction. Derrida asks, and here I quote him, could one address in general if already some ghost did not come back? If he loves justice, at least, the scholar of the future, the intellectual of tomorrow, should learn it, and from the ghost, end quote. We need to learn how to let the ghost speak and how to let the past speak, rather than leaving them behind or speaking for them. Related to this temporal shift is an emphasis on the universality of the history, the story, for a future humanity, and perhaps a future beyond humanity, which eclipses the particularity of any past event. This cannot be an understanding of the past in a possessive form, a restrictive my or ours, but instead, it needs to be a universal they, of which we are and are not a part. This is to say that the past event can only serve us if we look beyond its particularity as past and toward its guidance toward their future. This is a conjuring of past, present, and future that is an exorcism of sorts. An exorcism, and I'll quote Derrida once more, not in order to chase away the ghosts, but this time to grant them the right, if it means making them come back alive, as revenants who would no longer be revenants, but as other arrivants, to whom a hospital memory or promise must offer welcome, without certainty ever that they present themselves as such, end quote. In welcoming these ghosts, not as remnants of the past, but as the site of emancipation, our new compass of history points us to what can be, rather than what has already passed. It points us to the surge, the site of dynamic temporal entanglement, where the past arrives as if new, calling for intervention and engagement. My hope is that this will be the past as future, if you will, rather than the future past. Thank you very much.